honoured to be here. I'm really delighted to see that we had to go and get extra seats, Keith. I just want to say, I have to leave early, so I just wanted to say something very briefly about the importance of what these guys have got together and AR Online. It is a remarkable resource, I'm sure you know that. But those of us who still need to find accurate facts for stories that we write in every day, use it all the time. And the thought that Keith and his henchmen have done this just out of the goodness of their own, well, with their own motivation, is I think remarkable. I wrote down 4 things that I particularly rate both Keith and AR Online for. One is quality. We know how good it is. It's been tested by people who were there. One, obviously, what comes off that is accuracy. You can trust it. The remarkable thing to me, knowing what it takes to put something like this stuff together, is dedication. Imagine the dedication that it's taken to put all those pages together. Amazing. And the last thing I want to talk about was joy. One of the trustees of this place until recently was Stephen Norman, who some of you will have worked with, was the boss of Vauxhall. And he talks about, he's worked for 5 or 6 different companies, and he says that absolutely the best time that he had in his career and the most enjoyable was BL Rover, Boston Rover, etc., because of the culture and the joy of the place. And I think what AR Online manages to do is to inject that joy even into the pages when you're looking up information. So I just want to say congratulations, fantastic effort, 20 years of non-stop achievement, and we look forward to more and better. Good luck to you, Keith.
Thanks, Steve. The real stars of AR Online, as I said before, are you guys, super fans. These guys here who were there, who created the products that we all love. They marketed the products that we love. They helped us, muttering rotters, write about the cars that they created. So I think it's only right that we spend our time here today to talk through some of the achievements and open the floor, get these guys earning their keep. You know, I bought them coffees. I mean, I'm going to get banned from my budget. So, oh, booze, yeah, absolutely. So, format's going to be really informal. I'm just going to say I'm going to introduce these guys one by one. I'm sure you all know them, and I'm going to take questions for them, and then I think what will happen is that these guys will create some magic. So, I do recommend you record what we're about to do, because it's going to be great. So, on my left, I've got Mike Humble here. He's my oppo, my left-hand man, right-hand man, all-hand man. So basically, Mike joined me on AR Online back in 2011, and Mike kind of typified the super fan, the informed super fan. You know, Mike fixed these cars.
2009, actually.
2009. Thank you. Yeah, so Mike's fixed these cars, Mike sold these cars, and one day I got this email from a random. I get lots of emails from random, and basically he sent me a picture of this Rover 214 SI, or SLI. He basically bought it for 100 quid. It had been dragged out of the hedge. It looked like well, it looked like me after a particularly bad press week, and that's how it looked when he got it. But by the time he'd finished with it, it looked.
It was really knackered.
It looked and smelled like a new car. And Mike, what really switched me on to Mike was just the comedy, the joy in his writing. He's such a great writer, and he's such an asset to have on the team. And I couldn't have done it without him. So I'd say, put your hands together for Mike. To the left of Mike, we have Kevin Jones, and Kevin Jones joined the firm 78 for Triumph as an apprentice, and from there you moved over to, you became part of the Austin Rover organisation, ended up in the press garage before moving over and becoming a press officer.
Life in PR.
A life in PR from that point on, and Kevin is such a nice guy. even today he's been carrying my coats and opening the doors. And I have to keep reminding him, you know, that we're not here on business, we're here for pleasure. And but yeah, and absolutely.
Never die.
And the other thing I'd say about Kevin, he is the guy that lent me my first ever press car. So back in 2003, I wrote a rather grovelling email to MG Rover and said, I've got this little site and it'd be really nice to review some of your cars. Please could I try your car? Kevin organised me an MG ZT V8 for a week with a full tank of fuel. Man alive.
Start at the bottom.
I felt like I'd arrived. And this was probably just before the sad times, as we all know. And I think Kevin won't mind me saying that he smiled through all of it. He smiled through the bad times and switched the lights out at the end of it, which probably was a very emotional moment for Kevin. And I remember a couple of days after it all happened, I rang him up on his mobile phone and said, how are you, Kevin? Are you okay? He said, well, I'm okay. I'm just actually standing in the queue of the job centre at the moment. Can I call you back? and that moment really hit home. It felt like it was over at that point. And 6,000 employees at Longbridge. It was quite a tough time.
The fact is, I was the first to be re-employed. Was the good silver lining.
Absolutely, absolutely. To the left of Kevin, we have Denis Chick. Denis Chick is an absolute star. He's a legend in our business.
It's the other one.
For anybody who watched that wonderful documentary, sorry, I've got to say it. For anybody who watched that wonderful documentary when Rover met BMW, Denis. That's the one.
He's got everything.
Denis was the man that had to deal with the wine request from Russell Gray.
It wasn't drinkable.
No, it wasn't drinkable.
That's very
Now,
good.
Denis has been part of the firm for a long time. He worked on Rover P7, Rover P8. Started out as an apprentice at the Rover company, moved over to British Leyland, and had a stellar career and ended up running Director of Communications in the 1990s. This was the era when Rover was back. They had the R8, the 400 to 600, even the Metro. I mean, the Metro was a fabulous car in 1990, and that again is one of those stories of the engineers achieving the impossible. So yeah, put your hands together for Denis. Last and certainly not least, we've got Ian Pogson here. Ian is a guy who will just do anything to help anybody. You cut him, he'll bleed firm. He's absolutely a top guy. So Land Rover.
Yes, started off.
And BL Technology before that.
After that,
sorry.
Yeah.
And went on to be one of the few guys that actually carried on working for the firm in the Chinese years and ended up working over in China. He's published a great book on the subject, which I recommend anybody look up on Amazon. You'll still be able to get it. Can you still get it?
Yeah, carry on car making, yeah.
Yeah, so please have a look at that one. And Ian will tell you anything that you ask about TF and about any other product, basically. So put your hands together for Ian. So, without further ado, what I'll do is I'll take some questions. So, if you've got any questions for any of our guys here, please put up your hand. Steve.
So Musgrove really he knew. Just to fill in, he was for us hacks. He was a very difficult bloke, hard to interview, bad-tempered, had no time for the press at all. Thought we were the enemy, but I gather he went on to run a health authority and prove himself to be a good bloke. So I'd like to hear what he's really like.
Just before we do that, I have to say, so we've got Simon Weekly here, who's former marketing guy at Austin Rover. Simon, about 3 years ago, went away and basically recorded a massively influential interview with Harold, which is one of the reference pieces on our site. So we had a great time. I transcribed the notes, and it's just been an amazing thing. So fantastic insight again. Look up Harold Musgrove interview on our online. It's fabulous. But I'll hand over to Denis because I think we're all itching to hear.
Harold is
Denis
still
has.
with us. He's
He is very much still with us, yeah.
Sure.
And he's a charming fellow now. I don't know what he's like back in those days when he was dealing with you, but he's mellowed in his.
I think it was our fault, not his.
And he's got a hell of a memory because we had lunch with him. Was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and his memory is better than mine. I mean, my memory is. I need this kind of discussion to get the juices flowing. But Harold, no problem. I would say he was a friendly bastard. He was. Just think about the scenario that he was working in. He started off in his younger days in manufacturing operation. His first big job, I suppose, was running the Bargoed plant down near Swansea, where they made the J40 pedal car as much as other things. And he grew up in a manufacturing environment, which is always a hard one for anybody. I mean, I've met several manufacturing directors in my time. Andy Barr, who was his manufacturing director at Austin Rover, was
very few of them
was a nasty bastard. He wasn't a friendly bastard. But Harold was he was working in that background, and it's a hardening kind of background. But in the period I was working with him, he was of course dealing with massive political issues. He was dealing with massive issues with the unions. The Red Robbo era was a real challenge for him and the organisation. And he was fighting like hell with Margaret Thatcher to get some money to build the K-Series engine when she said, no, go and buy a Peugeot engine, that's all you need. And he stuck his heels in and we got the money for the engine. So he was under a lot of pressure in that organisation. A few little anecdotes. When I was in product planning, I was responsible for, first of all, in product planning for parts, accessories and rationalisation. Wonderful time. That was my introduction to product planning, but I went on to look after TR7 and ST1 after that. But in the time I was doing that work on the parts side, I had a project to introduce stick-on badges to all the cars. You probably remember these things. We thought we'd stop drilling holes in body panels that would rust instantly, and we stick them on instead. And I was making a presentation in the Elephant House. There's another story comes into this as well. And it was a metro presentation. Final details on the metro design, and then this badging. I was on last with the badges, and it was my very first ever presentation to the board and the standing committee. And I'll start with the first story, which is not related to what I was going to say afterwards, but that was the famous day when David Bache, who was the design director, Rover guy, responsible for all the brands in the organisation, but hated working for shit stuff like Austin and Morris and things. He was a Rover guy, and we were having a presentation on Metro, and things were getting a bit heated about certain designs, certain components on the car, and Harold and he were having a very tough time agreeing on something, which Harold didn't agree with, that David wanted to push. And there had been a lot of winding up going on before this. He didn't like David Bache. Bache didn't like him. But I could see there was going to be a crescendo here, and there was. It got heated, it blew up in the end, and Harold just banged the table and said, "Stop!" And he beckoned Bache, and they went we were in the Elephant House, the roundhouse of Longbridge, over into a corner office, and we could hear the conversation there was getting really, really quite loud, and it got louder and louder, and then suddenly went very quiet, and we thought he's killed him. And the door opened, Bache walked out of the door, he walked straight across the middle of the studio between us all, outside, got into his Tara Green Triumph Stag, disappeared, and we never saw him again. And that was the fatal day that Mr. Bache and he fell out terminally. And then Harold kind of rubbed his hands and said, "Let's get on with the badges then, Chick." And so I'm making my presentation about the badges, and I'm pretty nervous. And after that thing that went on over the corner there, I was really nervous. And well, halfway through the presentation, I did get something wrong. Actually, I presented the wrong thing, and I got the cost of the program. I think I put down to one badge instead of the whole program, which was like 4 and 6 for this whole stuff. It was £1 million or something. Anyway, at the end, and he stopped me and he said, "Say that again," blah blah blah. Anyway, at the end of it. At the end of the presentation, last item, he walked off and he turned around and he caught my eye and he did this. And come over here. Anyway, he took me into not the same office, but he said, you fucked up there, didn't you? And I said, yes, Harold, I did, I'm afraid. Yes, I'm just a bit nervous. It was my first one. He said, look, all part of growing up. He said, you need to remember blah, blah, blah. And he said, tell you what, he said, come and see me at the end of the week and we'll have a chat about things. Anyway, I went to his office on the Friday. And he became my mentor for about 6 months. We used to have a little chat every few weeks. His PA would call me up and he'd ask me what was going on, was I happy with what I was doing.
And sorry, big one.
And that was great for me. He was a really, really nice, kind granddad figure to me, but deadly serious. But as I say, when you look at the background of what he was working in, the environment he was working in, he had a really, really tough job to do. The very last day, when he resigned over his other issues, his PA called me and she said, Harry wants to see you before he goes. So I went up to his office, and in his office, on a big old offices, wooden panel walls and all this stuff, and a big like a sideboard thing again. And on the top of the sideboard was a model of a metro, and it was the model that was presented by BSM to Austin Rover, of this made by Bassett Loke, big brass thing, beautiful. And there was another one I think that was presented. They had two made. One was for Austin Rover, one was for BSM. And he said, whenever you come up to my office, he said, you're always looking at that bloody model over there. He said, and I have to, oi, Chick. And he said, I'm a bit worried about it. If I leave it here, it's going to get stolen. He said, would you like it? And I said, what? He said, will you take it away? He said, because it'll get stolen. He said, go and put it in your car and take it home. Look after it for me. So I did. And then the next morning, Anne rang me and said, by the way, there's a nice album of photographs here by Bassett Loke about the manufacture of the whole thing. Take it with you, take it with you. And I've got a little letter with his note on it saying, enjoy this model. And I've got it at home, and it will stay there until probably come here eventually. That's the kind of guy he was. He was a friendly bastard, and I had every respect for him in the way he was working, the environment he worked in. He was a lovely bloke. But yeah, he didn't stand fools gladly at all. If you didn't work with him, not for him, with him, then you were on a hide into nothing, I think. You had to push yourself, and you had to give your fine penner, and he was happy. If you didn't, he wasn't.
He got the Metro out, didn't he? I mean,
He did. He got Metro out. He got K-Series in, all that stuff. I mean, he pushed and pushed and pushed, and he achieved a huge amount in the time he was there for the business. So yeah, I thought he was great.
He ultimately sacrificed himself for K-Series, essentially, didn't he?
Yeah. He fought hard with Maggie Thatcher. She said, no, you're not having the money. And he went round the back door, front door, sideways, everything to make sure that we could get that investment in for that engine. He always said that's the heart of the car. If the heartbeat's not there, it's not our car.
Do you have any dealings with him, Kevin?
I in latter years in the press carriage times, got sent out to go and see him on Saturday morning. He'd want to go and I wanted to test on my drive, so Saturday morning I'd go there, I'd grease him the door, he'd often have his shaving tackle still in his face. But as a one-to-one, he was a lovely guy, but you knew his reputation came before him, and his bar, and I was saying to Steve earlier, there was another occasion where, at a launch that I think Steve had been to, the press garage used to fettle the cars the night before and presented them. And on this one occasion, so the story goes, Harold went to go and see the press garage, and one of the press garage engineers says, who are you? I'm Harold Musgrove. Well, I don't know you. Sorry, you're not allowed in. Nobody's allowed here, especially the press. And later the story got back to my then boss, Mike Brooks, and he was told to salute the guy because he's right, nobody should go in there. So, he knew he had his rules, but he could see why some of the rules even denied him access.
He personally fought to get rid of Red Robbo as well. He was up against it with that one. And he did a deal with the government and with the unions, actually, behind Robbo's back to get him out of the organisation, because he said, it's him or me, and if it's him, this company's dead. We cannot go forward like this. And he got, I think at the time, the business minister was Callaghan. He spoke to Callaghan, and Callaghan helped him with the union to make sure that Robbo did something else. So he did a lot in his time that was there, as I say, in a very difficult environment to get that company, keep it afloat and keep it running. He was a good guy. Well, he wasn't there for long enough really to get heavily involved with them, was he? Because he was on his way out by the time that really started to get going. He didn't like anybody interfering with his business.
The Austin.
Really.
The Austin.
It was the Austin, yeah. I mean, he wouldn't speak like that, obviously, but he would do his utmost to make sure that everything stayed in-house. Hence the engine, fighting for the engine. But I don't know about whether he had a strong relationship with Honda. I think it wasn't going for long enough until he was gone.
Can I ask if everyone's hearing this okay at the back of the room? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
For two managing directors who'd both been at BL, and I'd worked with at BL in the 80s. But when Steve Norman appeared, Steve was working for, still is working for PSA, Stellantis as it's called now, and he was the troubleshooter for Mr. Tavares, who runs Stellantis, and I think he got to know him very, very well in the organisation, and Tavares would send him wherever he was needed to sort things out. And when they took over Vauxhall, he was sent to the UK to sort out Vauxhall. And when I heard he was coming, I hadn't seen him for some years. I used to bump into him at motor shows and stuff like that. Steve's about this tall, and he's a Rottweiler, absolutely. And he came. The guys had got to hear about him. My fellow directors at Vauxhall got to hear about him through the grapevine. And I said nothing. And on the day he arrived, we were all sitting in the boardroom, and he came through the door, and he said good morning, and he looked around the room. He said, "What the fuck are you doing here?" And I said, "I could say the same about you, Steve. What are you doing?" Ian and I used to work at BL together. Fucking brilliant it was, he said. I'll tell you more about that. And so then I got the piss taken out of me from all my fellow directors. "Oh, you know another one. This is the second bloke you know from British Leyland." But when we were in board meetings, he would frequently talk about BL because he said to everybody, that was the best time of my life. And I tell you, we're talking about this subject right now, but when he and I were at BL, we would have done it this way. He never stopped talking about it, because he just loved the time. They were his formative years, they were my formative years. And the things we learned in that organisation during that period, 80s, 90s in particular, they stick with you through your whole life. And Steve is a classic example of somebody who still talks about it now, and talks about what he learned in the British Leyland days, being what he preaches still today. Just a little anecdote on Steve.
Any other questions?
Joel?
Somebody who was at the gates to receive them after their successful acquisition, and you might probably know the story, but when John Edwards and his colleagues, and talking about John Towers and Nick Stevenson, they'd gone through the nights for 50 days or something, putting this plan together. They managed to extrude what became MG Rover Group from BMW, only because they knew that the Alchemy proposal was going to ask BMW for another dowry on top of what was already been proposed. So the guys took the business ahead as a private enterprise, but of course we still had possession of it in our minds as it being a public company. So they'd always got a job against them. As regards the questions and the hindsight, that what they probably should have done is ring-fenced a few good engineers, marketeers and everything else and reduced the company and kept that going and allowed the rest to fall over rather than all of us go down. The DTI were sort of playing things out carefully because they'd already lost a bit of dignity from the negotiations. And in a sense, they allowed this plane to come into land but actually go through the floor and crash. When it had the body of some great people, had lots of equity, just didn't have the finances. And we did everything to make sure that company was exciting and a proposition going forward, but it was 5,000 or 6,000 people, as we've said, and that was too many to make it viable going forward. So my answer to you would be to have made a small company that could have carried on and merged.
When I wrote the story of the RDX 60, I think that's probably right in saying it's probably the only. Anyway, the last line of that story basically says lions led by donkeys. I think that's very much proven to be the case. What would you say?
Well, those last 5 years were the hardest but the most rewarding. As Dennis was sort of saying in the BL parallel way, we worked hard and we played hard, and to have had that experience and being at the forefront or in a leading part of it, it was just fantastic to see. It really hard. I'd go to work every day thinking, have I got a job? Because you never knew what was going to blow over next week. It was thoroughly hard. It was like an adrenaline junkie, because I'd have a phone going 1 minute and my mobile going the next, and I'd write press releases just by a sentence because I got so many interruptions. But I loved it. It was just such a thrilling place to be. It was traumatic. It took me a year to get over that situation. I was lucky enough to get a job pretty much straight away. But I have a lot of time for the Phoenix 4, greed aside. But it was their company. Why wouldn't they have protected themselves? They didn't have a pension, so they tell you. But I still don't think it would have worked any other way. And I do think what they did was good and allowed us to have the fun. They built that company. It's just a shame that the Chinese couldn't see the value in that at a crucial time.
But you know, in May 2010, when they formed this MG Rover company, did all of you feel optimistic that it would work? And
well, we were all too deep.
So those that went to Land Rover were laughing through the backsides of their smile. We were thinking, oh my God, what have we got? But we actually thought, do you know what? We're going to have to make a go of this. I say have to. We would rather have had that experience than have gone and got another job. Some people were displaced, but for all the hardship, I wouldn't replace any one day of that.
no, but did you feel that through people going to Land Rover instead of staying with Longbridge, did you feel you'd been depleted of good people?
No, because we had good people with us. In fact, we felt we got the ability to do things where perhaps Land Rover, and Ford had got this journey of difficulty. So although you got the security of the future, we got the excitement. As I said, I think to you earlier, you know, if I got a phone call from a journalist saying we're going to be at the Birmingham Motor Show, I'd lean back and say, John, are we going to the Motor Show? Yes, we are. There's the question. I could go to Kevin Howe and we'd get decisions made in a week that took a year or longer. So it's a very exciting time.
I worked from 1980 for Land Rover, BL Technology, then Land Rover itself, then through into Rover Group, then at Longbridge from 95 on, and I stayed there virtually through the Chinese thing to the end, for me anyway, 2015. And to me, I've had a privileged career. I have worked with some of the greatest brains on this planet, not just automotive brains, and worked with some fantastic product, but tragically worked on some very, very old factories. Now, I don't know what the figure is, maybe you guys can remember it, but just to open the door of Longbridge cost one of these and one of these, and probably your Willie as well. So it was really expensive because it was old. Yet, if you look at Nissan or Honda or Toyota, all of them were given ground that was flat, that was expandable, that had services, that had modern this and modern that. And we were working at the top of Heart Attack Hill in some cases. It was literally called Heart Attack Hill, the road from Endgate up to the cabs. And the transportation of bodies from, say, Westworks up through the paint shop, through Southworks, all that, was costly on its own. So your cost base to start off with was just ridiculously high. Heating old buildings, propping up old equipment. I put a lot of new equipment into the factory. That was part of my job in manufacturing engineering in the mid-90s. And some of the old equipment I had to replace, some of it had Air Ministry badges on it. When I was a foreman in the early 80s at Perry Bar running spiral bevel diff manufacture, crown wheels and pinion, I'd got War Ministry washing machines. I got rain coming through the roof that hadn't got any glass in it. The whole place needed bulldozing. Land Rover, for an example on its own, had 13 satellite factories, including Pengham at Cardiff, which made a fabulous gearbox, and Bargoed, which made fabrications as well as the petrol cars, all sorts of things. So 13 satellite plants for a low volume 4x4 manufacturer was entirely ridiculous. So the sensible thing to do was unweld the doors that had been welded shut in Eastworks in Solihull and put all of those factories in there. But all of those factories were little family companies, Percy Road, Perry Bar, 200, 250 people. They'd all got their own factory manager, his secretary, somebody finance, tool room, and machine to repair, did all the bits to make a factory work. They're all housing estates now, or whatever. And put them into this. But what the big mistake we made there, and this is very typical of the company, is to completely underestimate the culture of what was then going to go into an empty building. So you've got all these microcultures of these 13 plants going into this empty vacuum, and they didn't give them anything to sort of hang the hat on and this is the way, like Nissan would do. Right, if you've worked in the automotive industry before, so a gentleman here works at Nissan, we probably don't want you because of the baggage you bring with you. That was their view, which was an entertaining view. So we did lots of mistakes like that, but still throughout all of that, we're still working with some of the greatest people. And I've had a fabulous ride, the best fun I could have with my trousers on, in the jobs that I've done, and I've done lots of different jobs at lots of different places, and I did meet Harold Musgrove, but only on one occasion, which didn't leave me with a favourable view of the man. So friendly bastard, yeah, I can relate to that. But again, and I don't know whether it's right to mention this now, but Lance Cole has written a book called British Leyland From Triumph to Tragedy, which I heartily recommend. I've been in communication with Lance. What he does, unusually, is paint in the background to my career, to our careers, of what was going on with what Denis said, the political background to the company we worked for. And then when you see this background painted in, and you think, oh, now I know why that happened, and now I know why that happened, and why Harold had such a hard time getting cake on, and now all the Red Robo thing, and he was just a figurehead. There was many more like him. But then also, on the other side of things, particularly at Longbridge, there were many production stoppages, and it became known for that. And it was usually blamed on the workers, which was wrong, because quite often the management hadn't got the ability to order parts correctly, to turn up at the right time in the right place. Now, I worked in logistics, so I'm talking from some experience. Later on, we were brilliant at it, but in the older days, we were not. So if you've got one part missing, if that's a part in your car and it's missing, you haven't got a car, have you? It's got to be 100% there. It's a most enormously complex thing to do, to get it out on the road. So if we haven't got that, you can't build cars. So the cost of not having that part is immense, because the whole factory really has to stop. Because otherwise, you're making cars minus that bit and putting them in a field out here. And everybody does it. I've been to Detroit, I've seen Ford doing it, I know the company who worked for them putting them right. Roush. But you've still not got a car. So in order to present a different face, sometimes the management would say, right, we're fucked up there, we haven't got the parts in, right, we'll go and upset someone on the line. And quite often they'd pick a woman. They'd go down and find that woman and abuse her. All the lads would go, you're not abusing her, whatever. Right, we're out. And then it looked like the workers had stopped work, but actually the management had failed.
It was orchestrated.
It was orchestrated. So that's just a part of what went on. Yeah, there were some great people, but yes, there were some clowns. I've worked for quite a few of them. I've worked for people with big brains and fabulous people, engineers, people, but also I've seen lots of clowns, and it's a balance in any business, whether the clowns win or the really smart people win. And we could probably name lots of clowns and lots of really good people on one hand. So maybe that just is a bit of a wander through.
That's why it's hard you and I to be a reputation department.
Well, Mike was, sorry, I was just going to come back, because Mike was at the coalface. You were fixing the cars and you were selling the cars. You were selling the cars in the MG Rover era. So
Actually, just a bit before as well.
yeah. So what would
Just a bit before.
What's your view on the Phoenix?
The interesting thing about the Phoenix 4 is that is from, or rather, not so much the Phoenix 4, but let's look at it at Rover Group in the BMW era, and then Rover Group or MG Rover in the post 2000 era. Is that when you were looking at selling a vehicle, if you're selling a vehicle off the peg, i.e. standard car, standard colour, then yes, you know where they are. But with Rovers, and especially with 600s and 800s, when they got a little bit posher, people used to like to put their stamp on it. They want optional extras or fancy colours and this, that, and the other. Now, in the BMW era, you would take the order from the customer, and that would be then put forward, and you would be aiming to look for an estimated date of arrival of the car. In the BMW era, if you say you wanted an 800 and a certain shade of this with that fitted in it and that radio instead of this, and you put the line of communication in, you get back, don't know when we can do that. Or just tell the customer standard 90 days, 3 months. And a lot of the time, a British car built in a British company, the customers wouldn't take to that whatsoever. Now then, selling the car in the Phoenix era was brilliant because the line of communication went from being a bowl of spaghetti to as close as where you are. So you as the salesman, and I was lucky because I worked in a Phoenix operated dealership in the latter part of it. We would pick up the phone, we would literally dial a Birmingham number, and to speak to some guy in the roundhouse, or where was the Oakland offices where sales and marketing were?
Opposite
Yeah,
the round.
yeah. You put a line through and you say, right, I want a 45 in, or let's say my old car. Well, a 75 in Moonstone Green, but the guy wants this, that, the other. We'll look into that. We'll get back to you in 5 minutes. You put the phone down. You say to the customer, "Would you like another?" "Oh yes, please." And you get a phone call through. "Yeah, week on Tuesday." They could adapt to change.
We got good at ordering parts.
So this is interesting. So quickly that it came from being part of a massive company that you felt that you didn't know why they were there, BMW, to a smaller business that you actually felt part of it. Yeah. There was stories of when they were bringing out the facelift 75, for example, how not well perceived it may have been. Who was I was talking to about German engineers and British engineers? Was it you, John? There was somebody I was talking to when you were on outside. And in the BMW era, all the BMW guys, when it was 5 o'clock, they would go home. That would be it. They'd be gone. 5:30, bang, clocked out, gone. And you would hear stories of guys working at Longbridge or whatever at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. Not necessarily getting paid for it neither, because they had that much passion and a bit of fire burning in their belly to get the job done. So they'd be there till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, stories about getting a 75 V8, stopping the tramping. There were stories of making their own pits and climbing underneath them while cars were wheel spun, just to try and figure this thing out. And
what fun do they have?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But to enable you to ask some more questions, I will say one thing about the Phoenix 4, and certainly about with respect to John Towers, who was kind of like the main man, if you like, who took a hands-off approach. I do recall being in the Birmingham area at the time in 2000 and listening to the legend that used to be Ed Doolan. It used to be on a morning from 9 till midday with his consumer show on Radio WM, and it was literally 5 minutes after it had all happened, it had all been agreed, yep, and the pictures were there with him having his glass of champagne. I remember him talking to Ed Doolan on the programme where he came out with a very interesting thing very early on that in their defence, or rather in Tower's defence, has never been publicised, and I absolutely remember him saying, "We are nothing without a collaborative partner."
Exactly.
And he said that in 2000. He said, "We are nothing." He's looking for, because even Doolan's just a journalist. He doesn't understand the motor industry. But he said, looking forward, where do you need to be, and where do we go from here? And Towers said, and I remember listening in the car that day, and he effectively said, "Moving forwards without a collaborative partner, we are nothing." And unfortunately, 5 years down the line, that came to be, despite them courting.
Should they have looked to India rather than China?
China was a growth market. India like Russia, another developing market, but China was the more responsive and bigger market potentially. So it was definitely the right target. It was the only one that was receptive. But of course, these times were at a time when companies were retrenching rather than opening their arms to collaborative ventures.
Okay.
So it was unfortunate timing. But that's the story of British Leyland.
Because I just bought a City Rover a while back, and
Yeah, I took one home once. Never again.
but what I was going to say is that, do you think that there was a golden opportunity with Tata that we all kind of just didn't see?
Well, I think with Tata, John Edwards engineered this relationship. He was a dealer first and foremost. He wanted a volume product, not as a gift, but as already invented, if you like. We knew the car wasn't fit for what we felt was a European purpose, so Indica 2 is what we tried to force them to bring to market. We got all the talents and the engineers to do it. Actually, from a styling point of view, pretty thing even today, I think, for what it is. But it had shortcomings, and talented engineers did everything they could, but the persuasion of change wasn't Tata's to make because they didn't feel it was necessary. They could sell every 2 million cars they could make. And it was inevitably too late, but the truth of it was that there was a company that was a Rover brand trying to sell Rover as walnut and leather, and only in the last days of the Rover 25, every model of it had walnut and leather. So we knew what the brand needed. It needed money and investment and whatever. It wasn't going to survive because of City Rover. Good job though it was. It was the wrong volume product probably at the time.
Any other questions? Okay.
Just to follow up on the point, the journalists, I noticed.
Can't be to the front, but it's very interesting to see the way this is received. From a business point of view, obviously we have relatively new platforms in 25, 45 and 75, so the Rover brand was fairly safe, if not on its own path as luxury and things, but for MG it could grow. So it seems obvious now, doesn't it? But to have had an MGR, ZR, ZS and ZT was obvious. The TF was a fantastic, the best facelift of any car I think there's ever been. It's just a great experience, that car. But the brief was to build a staircase to heaven. And so it might be a romantic thing, but we had a situation where Cavalli, I was at Le Mans in 2001 when Cal Cavalli was invited over, and they bought the company. Now that was so that they could have their play, but it was also a serious proposition. And after Peter had done a second wind after 9/11 with X80 and made it into the aggressive car it was, it's a very attractive car. I've got one in the next road to me, and it still looks flipping fantastic. 15 years on. What I was going to say was, sorry, that we had the ability to do motorsport, so we put some sex appeal into the brand, and it was great to live that. I mean, from 1 minute I was doing flipping rallying 1 minute, touring cars the next, and touring on. It was fantastic. There was an awful lot going on, but there had to be because we got partners. We got Nick Stevenson that had come out. I'm going to forget just as I'm talking about it. Sorry, a Lola. So we got this car, and they wanted something for their time. We got a Le Mans car. It was great, but it did seem to everybody we were doing too much too quickly. But we had to get this passionate, and as you said, John Towers knew we needed a partner. We didn't need it in 2005, we needed it in 2002. So this perpetuated journey that you've got to understand was not for the want of asking and trying to excite people. And if it wasn't Fiat engines or everything.
Almost like PR.
Well, it was a PR job. Yeah. It was about reputation and trying to make two brands out from one. And the V8s, we've got Triumphs here. Triumph Apprentice, but we had Dolomites, for example, that were front driven, rear driven. Only the 75 could be, bless it, moved from Cowley to Longbridge, front driven, made to be rear wheel drive, and it wasn't just any old rear wheel drive, as you said from the tramping thing. It was a thoroughly engineered car that was made on the same production line. Nobody else has done that. So credit where credit's due.
The thing is actually getting all those three product lines down the one track as well as a work of art.
Well, there's two. Yes.
But within the confines of the space, they managed to get a large car in a factory that would
I
never
remember
build a
seeing
large car.
guys leaning back on a barrier trying to fit prop shaft bolts. Yeah, the guy on the track would do anything because he was a can-do or she was a can-do person.
Yeah.
And that was great, but Cavalli, whoever said that car was homologated for the States, therefore we must have it so we can sell cars in the States, never saw an underneath of the car before. was not an engineer. I was with Rob Aldecker for 2.5 hours yesterday, because I'm writing a piece on MG and racing, which is something I know nothing about.
Sport racing.
Sport racing, yeah. But the subject of the article I'm writing is MGs and racing. So Rob was the head of sport and racing, and it was interesting to hear his view on the Le Mans car and all of that. I mean, he loves his racing, but even he questioned the Le Mans bit, because that, again, is a lot of money. And Lola was, there was some dodgy characters in
But
there.
they still did it. They still got
It
it.
would have been a one-horse race with Audi, if not.
Yeah,
But the fact that the car never ran for more than an hour,
Yeah.
and then did 18 hours.
But the great thing was, we love, as Brits, we love an underdog, don't we? And every race you went to, there'd be people in Chernobyl green and grey, wouldn't there?
We all,
Cheering.
yeah.
Yeah, it'd be staggering. And that
But the
was-
passion and power was like a fountain of champagne.
Oh, yeah.
It's just absolutely adrenaline junkies, isn't it?
The hospitality budget was more than Audi, wasn't it? Sadly?
No, it wasn't. We had the Fortuneers. It looked like it, but no, it wasn't Audi budget, I tell you. It wasn't, no. we didn't
Because
have
you
time
had
for that.
bugger all backup, you had bugger all spares,
But
but you had loads of pretty
John
girls
Towers always
to
says,
drink. Lots of-
for every pound you spend, I want £1.50's worth of value from it. And that drove us. Everything we did, it wasn't done on the cheap, it was done on the clever.
Oh, right.
And we didn't have a budget, so we just had to maximise it. And that was half the fun of it. It wasn't easy, but we didn't half get some excitement from getting more for our money, and we spent wisely.
God, they didn't half capitalise it on the dealership level,
Oh yeah.
which is a complete polar opposite to how it's gone with MG6 and all that. Where at best all they were doing to capitalise was sticking a couple of cars outside a Tesco supermarket on a Saturday.
But we also knew that the customer was king, and the customer needed
Race on
growth.
Sunday, sell on Monday, isn't it?
Time for one more quick fire question from the floor.
I've got one on publicity.
Is it quick?
Quick. Austin Metro launched 1980. That filming through Lebanon, the advert in Suffolk. Why was it?
The Metro ad on the White Cliffs of Dover.
Why was it chosen, and who chose it?
I have no idea because there was the marketing people. They're the ones that we never spoke to the marketing.
They had no say in that.
They were the flower arrangers. We did the proper job. You mean the Metro ad on the White Cliffs of Dover?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which was we are the Brits. We're going to push away all these bloody imports.
Yeah.
Dorlands.
And
Yeah.
I'm pleased you said that.
It was very
because-
British.
I'm pleased you said it was Lebanon. Because I've often
Was it?
wondered.
I don't know where it was, but it was terribly British, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Lebanon. Yeah, definitely.
And it was probably
Yeah,
worth
there's
doing.
no boys salutes as in
That's
the
it.
bars,
Yeah.
But do you remember also there was some PR in the days beforehand that said a car's been spotted on the motorway doing 100 miles an hour, and they think it's the new Metro.
Yeah, which part of the motorway was that?
The M4, no, it wasn't M46.
It was a closed bit somewhere.
Close bit, yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to ask each of you now to sum up, because we've got a quiz to do, and then we've got auctions and stuff there, but also there's snacks there, and I want you to kind of all dig in there and get the energy up a bit. But before we do that, so I'm going to ask each of you what your favourite firm product is, and I'm going to try and limit it to 1 minute. So I'll start with Mike.
R8. 200, 400 R8. Just because, apart from the later ones when the gaskets started to go wonky on them, they were just a straight out of the box car, and it just showed that with the right ingredients, what Rover could do with their input, and it distanced themselves from all the tripe that they'd been doing before.
Kevin?
It's a very broad question. There wasn't a car I launched that I wouldn't put my name to. But if you imply the car that I most enjoyed as my personal car, it would be an R8 3-door. Now this came along when there was a sort of slight body kit front bumper. We also had, I think, an RSP roll bar or something. But that car looked the business. I've never ever driven a car since that went around the corner so well. So that would be my car. That's been red as well.
And also apparently Russ Swift says the best handbrake that any car has ever driven.
Even a Montego?
Even a Montego.
Dennis?
Based on the first car I ever worked on, which was a P6 2000, when I've got a nice TC, I will go for the 75 because that brought back to me the core, proper British engineering kind of feel. The engineers there who designed a vehicle to do a job, using their now being sophisticated. And I know we had BMW underneath the Rover 75, but that BMW's engineering took me back to the days of Rover engineering, proper, true excellence in engineering. And that car now, I've got a 75, which is, I just love driving it because it says to me everything that Rover always did say before it got consumed by the rest of the organisation, but it popped up again right at the end in the 75 for me, so it's a 75.
Ian?
Because I was the last chief engineer, I'm tempted to say the TF, but that's kind of a love-hate relationship because it was so cheaply done. So I'd go, not one better than Dennis, but I'd go ZTT because I just love that car, an MG ZTT, and it, I'm sorry, it just has to have a V8 in it.
Thanks very much. So if everybody wants
What's yours?
Mine? Oh my goodness, I didn't think anyone would ask me that. SD1. SD1. I think, I know there's people who worked in the company who spoke to me about the SD1 project who said it was actually a bit of a white elephant because the amount of money spent on it, because it kind of consumed money that should have been spent on other projects. But it was just a beautiful thing, and it was so cleverly engineered, and it was so far ahead of the opposition when it was launched that it just blew everything away. So I'd go the SD1.
Interesting, quick observation on that one. The team that worked on that car was disappointed in the fact that we got this massive team of 4 cost control engineers came in just before that car started engineering, and we just said it was a Rover Ford Cortina underneath because it had max strut front suspension, solid rear axle. It was it wasn't a Rover anymore. You go from a P6 to an ST1 and look at the engineering, and we used to say it's just a Ford Cortina. It's just a shame we couldn't do what we really wanted to do, which was more like P8 underneath. P8 was double wishbone suspension, all the sophistication.
So was profit per unit though out of the car?
It was, yeah. It was all to do with the money.
So was Sven actually wedded to the SD1 then? Because he seemed to be at the launch, and he seemed to be in
but that was Sven King. Yes, that was Sven King. But no, disappointment was the thing with that car. That the company allowed the cost control engineers to take over the program, and basically started turning it into a Ford Cortina. A very nice, sophisticated Ford Cortina.
A glorious. So we'll take 5 minutes. Please help yourself to chocolates and cakes.
We need to do this again because there is so much more we have to touch on.
Well, we can do part 2 in 10 years' time.
We just have to rerun the video.
We'll get in.
Help yourself to snacks and then.